This is the Westminster Standard. I'm Ryan Beasy. Thanks for being with me for this second season of the Westminster Standard podcast. It has been a joy to have these conversations and to share them with you and to receive feedback via email and YouTube comments. It's a real encouragement to see how this podcast is being used to encourage confessional fidelity and renewal within the Presbyterian Church in America. And if you're able to join with us financially in that work of holding the PCA accountable to our confessional standards, both pastorally and theologically, please visit our website, jude3pca.org. Help us close this year strong financially. You can make a donation there. Our goal at Jude 3 is precisely that, to serve the Presbyterian Church in America by promoting the joyful, winsome, rich heritage of our confession of faith, which we share. And so we hope that the production of this podcast, as well as our newsletter, which comes out twice a week now, sending out both sermons and articles that are aimed to highlight both the good things going on in the PCA and the wider Reformed world, as well as resources to equip pastors and elders and deacons and church members to promote confessional fidelity as we work together in the Presbyterian Church of America before the face of God. So I hope you'll join us in that mission by the end of the year, or maybe in the coming year. You'd like to start out the year with a donation to Jude 3 and the PCA. Please visit our website, jude3pca.org. This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Covenant Theological Seminary is the PCA's only denominational seminary. And while Covenant Seminary is not the primary source of ministers for the PCA, it is an influence on the denomination, and undeniable at that. Many of the PCA's leaders and former moderators are graduates or past faculty at Covenant Seminary. Men such as Ligon Duncan, Duncan Rankin, David Hall, Carl Robbins, and many other revered fathers in the faith received their training at Covenant Seminary. And yet, in recent years, our denominational seminary has endured significant criticism as a contributing factor either in the PCA's revoice scandal or simply fostering a latitudinarian approach to the Westminster Standards rather than a more full subscription approach to the confession. Covenant Seminary has been criticized for producing graduates who tend to push the boundaries of Reformed orthodoxy rather than upholding the faithful, old-school Presbyterian witness of the PCA's confession and catechisms. Well, I'm not well equipped to assess those claims necessarily, but today I'm joined by three recent graduates of Covenant Seminary, PCA pastors who have come to love our confessional heritage and embrace the confession and its catechisms as their own philosophy of ministry. So let me welcome Charles Stover, Philip Ryan, and Nate Xanders. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Hello.
Well, Philip, you've recently published an article on Reformation 21 detailing your authentically broken faith journey to old school Presbyterianism and Reformed confessionalism. We'll come back to that frequently, I'm sure. But since this is your first time on the show, Philip, would you briefly introduce yourself, and then we'll go down to Charles and then Nate, where you're ministering now?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, Ryan. My name's Philip
Thanks
Ryan.
for being here.
Yeah, and I work for a good friend of yours, Pete Whitney, as his
I thought you were going to say Jesus.
Jesus, yeah, your other good friend. But I'm the associate pastor at the Kirk Presbyterian in Savannah, Georgia. And so we've been here 2 years this January. And before that, I was in bivocational ministry for 3 years in Alabama.
Chasing possums from the HVAC, as I recall.
That's right. Also, yeah, possum wrestler was part of my job description at that church.
Outstanding. And Charles, where are you?
Hey, Ryan. Thanks for having me on. I'm in Owensville, Missouri. Yeah. Small rural town in Missouri, around 2,000 people. Been here for 3 years at Redeeming Grace Presbyterian Church, and we love it. Graduated from Covenant in 2021.
All right. And Nate, where are you now? And when did you graduate Covenant Seminary?
Yeah, it's reprehensible to see you today, Ryan. Appreciate you having me on. No, I
Appreciate
graduated.
you coming back. I know.
Yeah.
I know. Sometimes it's iffy if you'll get to come back on.
Yeah, I'm a glutton for punishment. So I graduated in 2014. So I started in fall 2011, graduated from Covenant, and eventually got ordained in 2019. And ever since then, I've been here in Louisville, Tennessee, just south of Knoxville, ministering at Christ the King Church. And so we've been particularized for about 4 years now, and things are going well. Just got our first set of deacons, so that's exciting. So we're just kind of going down the tracks.
I think the congregation you serve may be proportionally one of the fastest growing congregations in our presbytery. So
it might be, yeah, about 22% a year. We counted the other day. I think we have like 30 to 40 kids ages 6 and under in a congregation with 100 members. So it's like an anthill full of children's been kicked over on Sunday afternoon after I give the benediction, and it's we wouldn't have it any other way. It's great.
Praise God. That's really encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
Why did y'all choose Covenant Seminary to be the place where you would get your theological training? Nate, we ended with you and your last alphabetically, so let's start with you.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So I grew up, part of my authentically broken journey is that I kind of grew up in what you might call the pietistic or evangelical wing of the PCA. And I'm so thankful for the church that I came into at age 9 with my parents. We'd just been kind of theologically and spiritually emaciated where we were before, which was a non-Reformed, non-Presbyterian church. And so we visited this PCA church of about 200 people there on the corner, literally on the exit corner of our neighborhood. And we became members quickly after that. And as I grew up in that church and wanted to go off to seminary, pretty much all the different men that were there in capacity in ministry, even though none of them had gone to Covenant Seminary, they all kind of unanimously, but individually apart from each other said, hey, if I had to start over again today and go back to seminary, I would go to Covenant right now. And so there was a Beeson grad and a TEDS grad and an RTS grad. And that was kind of the advice. And I think another guy was maybe Westminster Philly. So there was just all these different guys from different theological educational backgrounds that spoke volumes about Covenant. And so I decided to go there, received a scholarship that provided financially for me to go there. And so that was kind of how I ended up there. I just had men that were trusted mentors and spiritual fathers that recommended that I go there. We're PCA. I wanted to be in the PCA. It's the official seminary of the PCA. So it just kind of made sense. Everything kind of lined up in place for me.
What about you, Charles?
Yeah, I was born and raised in the Southern Baptist Convention, and I was serving a small church in South Arkansas at the time as a youth pastor, and going to Southern Seminary online. And then I discovered Calvin, and then I discovered the Westminster Confession. And I reached out to the nearest PCA pastor to me, who was about an hour away. And he basically listed off the list of Reformed seminaries, Westminster, RTS, and Covenant. And I took a look at all of them, but Covenant actually offered me a job to assist with management and maintenance and things like that. I think I was profiled as when I was interviewed. They asked if I could drive a stick shift and if I could turn a ratchet. And I said,
if you could get things off of the top shelf, I'm sure.
Right. Yeah.
Nobody ever asks me to do that.
Can't imagine why.
Me neither.
So I could drive a truck, and I had some experience in basic maintenance, and so they gave me a job and a good scholarship my first year there. So that really helped things. So it really helped narrow the decision down to Covenant. So we moved up there in the winter of 2017.
Right. Well, I'm glad you discovered the Westminster Standards, because I've sure found them useful since you discovered them.
They're okay.
What about you, Philip?
Yeah, so I was raised Pentecostal actually,
Mm.
and then came into the Reformed Presbyterian world when I was living in Fort Lauderdale under the ministry of Tully Chivigian. So he had just taken over at Coral Ridge, and I didn't. My dad actually was a huge Billy Graham fan, and so he said, "Tully Chivigian's Billy Graham's grandson. He's supposedly great. Go listen to him preach." And he was. He was a good preacher. But that was when I got first introduced to Reformed theology, and then several months later, I still felt an inward call to ministry. I've written about what happened before that, also at Ref 21, so people can go there to read about that. But I had been to a seminary once before, and so I just knew Presbyterians were highly educated. The PCA probably had its own main, official seminary. So I just Googled PCA seminary. Covenant came up, and so I didn't apply anywhere else. I knew of Reformed seminary, but they weren't the PCA seminary, so I didn't go. No offense to RTS, you guys practically are, but that was just that was a big factor in my decision making.
Yeah. So you go to Covenant, and it makes sense. It's the PCA's official seminary. So did you get a sense of the confession of our doctrinal standards there? And is that where you learned the confession, or did you feel like you learned it somewhere else?
Well, I guess this is part of why the article got written. So when I was there, so first of all, a friend actually reached out to me about this, and we were talking about before we got on here. So I didn't earn an MDiv at Covenant. I earned a degree that they don't even have anymore, but I still took all of the biblical studies classes, all the languages. I had to take some systematics courses and some church history courses. So I was still in and around all the classes with the guys studying for pastoral ministry. And especially with, we should work our confession into all those classes, I would think. But that wasn't really my experience. So we had a class that every student had to take. I'm sure it's still around, called Covenant Theology, which is not so much about covenant theology, but more of like doing theology the way Covenant Seminary would like you to do. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it was more of like an introduction to the way Covenant Seminary is going to train you to think theologically and hermeneutically and things like that. And so the capstone of these classes that you take at your first year at the end of the fall and spring semesters is a oral defense. It's you and a group of guys, and you're asked a whole bunch of questions. I mean, it's pretty rigorous. Wow. And you have to memorize a couple of passages from maybe the confession and the catechisms. That was kind of like the extent of it. I remember one other systematics class I had with Mike Williams, who I think has since retired. There was also some, we interacted with the confession a little bit, but outside of that, I mean, it was pretty much, we read Reformed systematicians, not necessarily the confessional documents. And there was my biggest regret of my time at Covenant was Dr. Calhoun was still alive. He was old, not doing very well health-wise. He was emeritus, but he still had an office on campus, and he would still teach a elective, I think each semester, just one. And one year he was teaching the Westminster Standards. And I tried absolutely everything to take his class in the confession, but I was too far along in my program. I really had zero wiggle room left, so I didn't get to take it with him. And he passed away not too long, I guess a couple of years after that. But so I learned more of the confession after I left the seminary. Wow, that was my experience. I'm sure these guys got some input to that as well.
Yeah, the two of you, the tall people on the show, you were divinity students. So I assume that the confession and the catechisms were, sort of the backbone of that program then.
Well, I wouldn't say that. To Covenant's credit, like I said, I grew up in the evangelical wing of the PCA, so I actually didn't know what the Westminster Standards were until I got to seminary. My college ministry, again, I didn't know we had an RUF at Tennessee Tech until I had already graduated. And so I went through campus outreach and FCA and that kind of stuff. So they're not using the Westminster standards, right? And fair enough. It makes sense. So I get to Covenant Seminary and I remembered, oh yeah, we had an associate pastor that like twice a year when the senior pastor was completely out of town, he would like work a larger catechism question or shorter catechism question into the liturgy. And I'm thankful for that. But I thought it was just I didn't know it was like the PCA's constitution. I thought it was just some kind of theological reform thing that he kind of liked. So I discovered, if you will, the standards in seminary. They were part of some of the different, the appropriate catechism questions were a part of various systematics courses. They were used, some of the larger catechism stuff on the 10 Commandments were certainly used in our Christian ethics course with Dr. Doriani. But it's different. I can say this now comparatively because I'm a Master's of Arts of Counseling student at RTS Charlotte. And I think my experience, even in the counseling program at RTS, is that the shorter catechisms are much more of they hit you in the face on the door in. I mean, you have to read them and subscribe to them to a degree in order to even apply, whereas that's not the case at Covenant, so it's just a different integration of the standards into the institution, if that makes sense. So they're there, but they're not, they're not the foundation of the philosophy of ministry, like you would see in Philip's article, that's kind of a difference. Mm-hmm. And maybe Charles would agree or disagree, but
no, I think I agree entirely with both of you guys. And I think all of us would agree that we're speaking from past experiences. We don't have I have very little insight into what's been going on at Covenant the past 3 years, even though I'm a relatively new graduate. But I would say, yeah, the confessions just were not taught at all during my time there. And I got to be careful with what I say here, but I just think I'll give you, to some degree, the confessions were they were always brought up in a critical tone.
Yep.
Philip, I remember the same class that I took, you mentioned covenant theology. The professor during my time there actually required us to learn 5 questions of the shorter catechism and to give the answers orally in class at the end of the semester. Well, a week before the assignment was due, the professor stood up and said, "This is a fake assignment. We just put this in here so that people within the denomination would not criticize us for not teaching the shorter catechism."
That did not happen while I was a student there, but I have friends that were there around the same time you were, and they've corroborated that to me. I wasn't going to bring it up because I didn't witness it, but I've heard that from other guys during your era. So
that actually, sorry, not to interrupt you, Charles, but that actually was said when I took that class. And I know they've rotate the faculty through that, teaching that, so I'm not sure it was the same one, but it was brought up so that when we're asked on, ordination exams, did you interact with the catechisms? You can say yes.
Sure. And I had another professor who said that if I catch you on the presbytery floor and you do not take any exceptions to the confession, then I'm going to embarrass you. Yeah. To the extent that those comments were made, that's the kind of attitude that I picked up as a Southern Baptist transitioning into the PCA. It was just really confusing for me as a student. So yeah, I wouldn't say that it served as the backbone in any sense whatsoever during my time there.
Yeah. So that's.
Are you okay,
curious.
Ryan?
I'm kind of. It's one of those.
Someone
things
reboot him.
Yeah, I'm struggling here as an RTS Jackson graduate. Now I had a class, with Guy with Guy Waters, and he said, all of you need to list all of the differences for this class. It was an elective, it was like studies in Reformed theology or issues in Reformed theology. I think it was one of the best classes I took, right up there with covenant theology at RTS, which was about covenant theology. But he said, you need to list all of your differences with the standards. And then I think what Guy did was take every single student in that class out to lunch and talk through each of our differences with the standards and say, well, this is, he's an excellent, polity theologian, even though he's a New Testament scholar, he still knows his polity and his history and his theology, and to help us think through what the confession and catechisms mean. Was that the sense in which he said? Because I do get frustrated when guys come to the floor of Presbyterian, they say they have no differences with the standards, and maybe they should be embarrassed by somebody that, well, okay, what's a stew, as Brad Isbell likes to point out, or what does it mean that the civil magistrate is to maintain the church? Because I think that there's a difference between having a difference and requiring an exception. Was that the spirit of that sentiment from the professor that you got?
Maybe partially. I think so. It's hard to tell.
Well, I'll give you an example. There was one professor, and you can, I won't mention the name, but if I could find the recording of this online, it's not that big of a deal. But he said, the Westminster Standards are the greatest document of its kind ever written.
Yeah.
And then he said, and then he cited a phrase from the larger catechism. Does anyone really believe this? He's basically just dismissing it out of hand. And it was about, no surprise, it's an exception, a stated difference that we're now seeing creep in more and more. We've seen it a couple times in our presbytery. To me, it's going to be the new one in the next 10 to 15 years. It's going to strike at the fifth commandment, the idea that sins against men of eminency and superiors are more heinous than a sin against an equal or an inferior. That was just kind of openly laughed at by the students as he said that. And to me, and this might get me in a little trouble, I think you have to be really smart to dismiss that from the larger catechism. I think you have to be so intelligent that you can reason because it's obviously true. Let's think back to that Saturday afternoon when Donald Trump was almost assassinated. If any one of the four of us is killed on the same day as Donald Trump, maybe 300 people know about it. And maybe 300 to 500 people are impacted by it. If Donald Trump is murdered at the same time as I am, the entire globe is impacted by it. It's obviously a more heinous sin. And I am, when it comes to like the bell curve of PCA pastors, I'm the knuckle dragging ex-jock. It's like,
if you weren't so tall, your knuckles would drag.
So that's the only thing that's saving me from being a Neanderthal. So it's like you just have to be, but when you're a seminary student and a brilliant man says something like that, you just kind of go, well, of course, that's ridiculous. I'm going to make that stated difference. And it's like, you all of a sudden think that by proxy, by sharing the stated difference with this incredibly intelligent man, that you're somehow also as intelligent. It's like, no, actually, when you really think it through, that stated difference is a terrible take because it just doesn't even pass the common sense smell test. So I think there's I think there can be a derision that's cast upon stated differences or not having them that is very dangerous, because we can start to outsmart the room and end up in obvious errors.
And I think, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead of us now, but so one of the things I remember, when I was at Covenant, we had several professors have different views of creation within the acceptable sort of quote unquote study report that the PCA's put out. And so one of the things that I was, heard in class and knew from a bunch of other friends as well was, when you're going before the ordination exams and things like that, and if you take a stated difference with, like Westminster Shorter Catechism question 9 or the Confession of Faith chapter 4 about, the days of creation, you can just refer to the PCA study report and just say, I'm in line with this. And so I used to hold a different view of creation. And when I was coming up for ordination, I had a great ruling elder who was chair of the Candidates and Credentials Committee. And so my Covenant training kicked in, and I said, well, yeah, I have a little bit of a difference, but my views are within the bounds of the PCA study report on it. And he stopped me and he goes, yeah, okay, don't say that.
Yeah.
He's like, we don't care. We want to know what you think and how it compares to the confession and the Bible. And if you have a difference, well, then you need, like, we'll work on that. And so let's really talk about it, but do not go there and say anything about that study report. He's like, it's just, advice to the body. It's not binding. And I was pretty embarrassed, actually. And I was like,
as you should have been, but your professor should have prepared you for that.
Yeah. But I was also thankful that it happened in a ruling elder taking his time out to invest in me before I even came up for my exam. And it actually ended up through that began a little bit of my own change of views on that as well. But anyways, that goes along with what we were discussing about, I think, how some of that came up at Covenant.
Yeah. So did you get the sense then that the primary emphasis of the faculty was to teach what the PCA believes in its confession and catechisms, or their personal or idiosyncratic views on the standards? I mean, I would assume that they're teaching this is what the PCA believes. Now, I might want to nuance that, but that the Covenant is teaching what the PCA confesses, right? Or was it at your time there?
Yeah, I would say overall the teaching was still, I mean, this is actually, I'm trying to think if anyone ever used the phrase, this is what the PCA teaches. There were certainly idiosyncratic views presented.
Sure. Which you would expect at an academic institution.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, they would still, what Covenant was trying to do well was prepare guys to be pastors. And so everything was always kind of brought up over and over again of, all right, yes, this is important, theologically, absolutely. How is this going to impact when you're preaching? How is this going to impact when you're counseling someone? How is this going to impact you as you're guiding a session or, dealing with all these things? But I'm not sure necessarily that we were presented with like what the PCA believes is really taught fully in the Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms. And actually, we don't, as a denomination, have any exceptions to these. So when you state a difference, you're actually saying you're out of accord with our system of doctrine. That I definitely didn't hear until much later. And you guys might be able to speak more to that.
I think a big part of the ethos of Covenant is something we were told on the front end was, it doesn't matter what you know. What we care about is who you become throughout your seminary journey. And it was all about, I guess, transforming you, sanctification, spiritual discipleship, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. I guess more of a kind of a sonship type emphasis on growth and whatnot. And that really, that had a lot of benefits, but it also contributed to what we've talked about is there was during my time there at least, there was a dearth of historical and systematic theology. There was just not an emphasis on those things, which really, comes back to bite you when you're pursuing ordination within the PCA, because it's pretty, you got to go through all the exams and know this stuff. So it's sort of a double-edged sword there.
Yeah, I would affirm that. I think I'm really thankful that I went to Covenant because I think there were certain rough edges and burrs that need to be taken care of, and Covenant was a good place for that. Some might argue that there's maybe some more of those burrs that could have been removed during my time there, but I'm thankful for that aspect of Covenant because they are focused on making you a good pastor. But there was, in my experience in our presbytery, Ryan, there was kind of this assumption, and probably rightfully so, that Covenant grads are going to really struggle with certain topics like systematics and the sacraments, and as they come through, licensure and ordination. And I think, to me, that's where it's problematic. I think, look, if the seminary wants to focus on kind of preparing men to pastorally minister in a more broadly reformed context, that's fine. But if you're going to be the official PCA seminary, your graduates shouldn't struggle in licensure and ordination for the PCA. That just makes sense to me. That seems to be a reasonable request. And
It's a no-brainer.
yeah. And so, and I do think, for example, I think the Christian ethics class, I mean, I go back to my ethics notes probably a couple times a year for the first 5 or 6 years of graduating. I would go back to those lectures and listen all the way through them again, because they're still in pastoral care. I'm dealing with a case right now where I'm trying to help a guy in my church make a decision about something, and I'm able to give him pastoral counsel through kind of that tri-perspectival Christian ethics lens that I was equipped with at Covenant. And so it's incredibly valuable. So there's so many positive things I could say about Covenant Seminary, and I'm still, the guys that I met with every week for 3 years, my Covenant group, I still connect with them, once a year for 2 or 3 days to catch up. And, so I love those guys. They love me. And I know that when we go to GA, I probably vote a different way than they do on major hot button issues. And that's okay. Because our friendship isn't just based on our affinity groups outside of, our relationship in the PCA. So anyway, I think that needs to be said.
That's good. So then what would you say was the emphasis on ministerial training as you perceived it in your time there? If it wasn't, the body of knowledge, the confessional standards, what was the emphasis then?
All that keeps coming up to me now is our motto, rooted in grace for a lifetime of ministry.
Yeah.
That was what, I'm not sure if that even,
yeah.
if that gets, I think, sorry.
Yeah, well, I would just riffing off of that. One of the things that was emphasized was not just how do we prepare you, in that motto, in the vein of that motto that Philip just quoted, but also how do we equip you for that lifetime of ministry and not burn out? Because when I entered seminary, one of the things that Covenant could boast over other seminaries was they had a much better rate of, I don't even know what the word is, but there's all these, longevity. There's all these statistics about guys burning out of ministry within 5 years. That for whatever reason, the people that study these things, 5 years is the marker that they use. And at the time I entered seminary, Covenant's number was, it was in the mid 90s of guys that are in ministry longer than 5 years, that they're making it past that initial burnout rate. And so there was a big, they were really focused on making sure that guys that entered ministry and planted churches, et cetera, weren't flaming out super quickly. And I really appreciate that. I think that's a very positive thing, because you spend, as I've written before publicly, we spend all this money training guys for ministry, and then they get completely burnt out within 5 years. And it's like, man, that was not a good use of the church's economic resources, if we're thinking about it from a purely economic
stewardship
standpoint. Yeah, it's a stewardship issue. So, the now retired Professor Phil Douglas was a big part of that secret sauce. He was really gifted at helping guys see, hey, here's all the different types of churches you could minister at. Here's all the different positions you could go for. And I think if you go for these positions here, you're going to be toast pretty quick. This is not going to be a good fit for you. And if you were to go to positions like this would give you lots of experience and give you opportunity to really flourish in your gifting and set you up better for the long haul. And so that was he was an invaluable resource to a lot of guys, I think, going through Covenant Seminary at the time. So
he gave me the best piece of ministry advice I still have gotten, which was Phil had this class. It sounded like something out of Harry Potter. What was that class called? Spiritual and Ministry Formation. Yeah. And but he had us all do this really in-depth personality assessment, and then he met with every guy one-on-one. to go over it. And one of them was, like skill set type stuff was part of the questionnaire. And I ranked really low on administrative skills. And he said, hey, some gifts, and skill, you just have or you don't. Others are skills that you can learn to grow. He's like, you have got to learn to grow that. Like, I'm not saying you have to be like an administrative ace, but you need to get this number up or you're going to suffer, and your church will too. Yeah. I was like, oh, okay. And so I still don't think it's a gift of mine, but I've definitely gotten better at administrative details because of that. So I agree with what Nate was going after. It was more of, it seems weird maybe to say pastoral ministry without necessarily the standards or the some of the more Presbyterian emphasis, but that was, I mean, they are trying to create men who will pastor and love people well and for the long term, for sure.
Yeah, agreed. That's right. And I'd say Covenant has an excellent, or it did have while I was there, an excellent homiletics program as well. I mean, Christ-centered preaching is just wonderful. Just a standard textbook within the Reformed Church, and it was still being taught while I was there, even though Brian Chappell was no longer there. Yeah. But my homiletic instructors and adjunct faculty, they were all very strong, and I was able to really learn quite a bit on how to preach. And that's not permission to give you. I'm not giving you guys permission to listen to my sermons, but certainly learned how to develop a sermon and steer people towards Christ from every text, and I'm very thankful for that. And also, I think too, the counseling emphasis at Covenant is very strong. Just helping pastors recognize the limits of their own strength. I think one of the things that Dr. Sklar had us say often, I know you guys know what I'm about to say, but he would have us stand up at the beginning of the class and say, "I am not the Christ," to remind us that we are his instruments and we are fallible. So. Yeah.
That's a very fond memory for me as well, Charles. So thanks for bringing that up. That just brings a smile to my face every time I think of it. So, his commentaries on Leviticus are on my shelf, and I preach from the book of Leviticus at least once a year, and always appreciate gleaning from his wisdom again. So. But that was another thing that I enjoyed about Covenant is that, just so many of the professors, brilliant as they are, very pastoral, very warm, godly, brilliant men. They really embodied grace. I can tell you one quick story. The end of Covenant Theology 1, that first semester, we had the final paper that you write is a hermeneutical process paper. And Mike Williams he taught that class at the time. And I turned in that paper. I actually skipped going home for Thanksgiving to work on it. I put about 45 to 50 hours of work into that paper. And I turned it in. As soon as I turned it in, it dawned upon me that I had just written the wrong paper, that I wrote a theology paper instead of a hermeneutical process paper. I called my dad on my flip phone because I still had one at the time. And I said, "Dad, I think I just totally blew up that class. I just wrote the wrong paper." And sure enough, I got a C. It was bad paper. And Mike Williams pulled me aside and said, "Hey man, what's going on with you?" He said, "I've seen your work all semester. This is not you, so something clearly is going on with you." And he just took time to actually pastorally care for what was going on with me, because they recognize, hey, there's spiritual warfare happening at seminary, and it's an emotional time. I mean, you got guys leaving their homes behind, their jobs behind, their careers behind, and it's a challenging time. And so he gave me a chance to rewrite the paper. And I did, and I got a better grade, and actually, made I think a B or A and minus in the class, and instead of a lot worse because of that paper. So they embodied pastoral care and grace, even in the midst of a rigorous academic season. And that's something that's not part of the curriculum. That's just part of the culture there. So I appreciated that. And I hope that no matter what direction Covenant takes in the future, that will always be part of their always be part of the culture there.
Yeah, indeed. Well, Philip, in your article, you reference broadly Reformed philosophy of ministry, and then you said that you came to a position of a shorter catechism philosophy of ministry, and you cite question or really answer number 88. And I know the other two brothers here have that similar philosophy of ministry. So, would you walk me through what does that mean? How is a shorter catechism, as you put it, philosophy of ministry not emphasized at Covenant? And what was it that brought the three of you to that sort of an understanding of how you're going to approach ministry?
I think so. Covenant has been extremely influenced by neo-Calvinism, Kuyperianism, transformationalism, whatever kind of philosophy of ministry you want to put on that, use to describe that. But that was kind of more their emphases. So it was, even when I was there was a big, lots of electives and conversations and connection to, how is your church going to be influential in the arts? How is it going to be influential in your city? I mean, are you going to be renewing the city? Are you going to be concerned with shalom of the city? All these types of things. And so it kind of made me feel, as I was thinking through future ministry, like I'm going to have to be a pastor, an outreacher. I'm going to have to be an activist. I want to be careful with the way I would phrase that. A social justice activist. I don't necessarily fully mean like a crazy SJW thing, but it's going to be really involved in that. And I got to be thinking about renewing my city. And they would obviously emphasize, like Charles said, I mean, the homiletics programs that great there. They're gonna emphasize, you need to preach the word, but it's kind of like you need to preach the word. But the way all this is going to be fully impacted is the programs and other various outworkings of ministry outside of Lord's Day worship. And the first time I kind of figured out that maybe that's not the healthiest way or the right way, was actually reading Martin Lloyd-Jones's biography, or Ian Murray's biography of Lloyd-Jones. And when Lloyd-Jones got to Westminster Chapel, he axed like everything they were doing, because they were doing all this stuff. They were doing the youth of something outreach, and they were doing this and they were doing that. And he said, we need to be about the word. And so we cut a ton of these things to focus rightly on the preaching of the word. And I think that's, and I think maybe we'll get to this, but when I left the PCA, that was kind of a realization that of a Presbyterian identity should definitely be anchored to the way our standards articulate it. And the way they articulate ministry is according to Shorter Catechism 88, that our primary emphasis should be on word, sacraments, and prayer. And so I'll even put this into like my own context. And recently, when I came to the Kirk last year, I entered a season where I had a bunch of things going on, like good stuff, ministry stuff. I was revamping our men's ministry. I was overseeing some things, and I also had to preach both services that an upcoming Sunday. And Pete was like, "Hey, all these other programs and stuff you got going on, they don't matter this week. Like, make sure nothing completely falls through the cracks. But you have Sunday coming up. You have got to preach. You've got to lead one of the sacraments. That's your emphasis. That's your emphasis." So that was, a sign that I was at the right church and under a good pastor. But that wasn't my experience. Now, I'm perfectly willing to be challenged on this. Again, I think, like even Charles said, this is kind of my recollection on it. I didn't take any of and I'm not sure how many Covenant even offered, but any of these specific, like, I don't know if this came up in either Charles or Nate's, if you guys had any like ministry classes that were particular to MDivs, or maybe they talked about an ordinary means of grace ministry. But from my personal experience, I never even heard that phrase until I was outside the Covenant.
Yeah. That's probably true. That's probably true. But I went to Covenant Pres down the street from the seminary. It's the church where the seminary started in the basement years ago in 1956. And yeah, I would say it's an ordinary means of grace church. They're doing Sunday school, 2 worship services in the morning. The different fold groups are meeting for potluck, and sometimes after church on Sundays, they're doing evening worship, which is not like a third service. It's a distinct evening worship service. At least they were when I was there. I think they're probably still doing that. And so I was, that was or I would say an Ordinary Means of Grace church right down the road. And so I got to kind of witness that. And I'm sure there was other, I know out in the Creve Coeur area in Chesterfield, there were other PCA churches that were doing what we would call Ordinary Means of Grace ministry, but then also, several of our, and I wouldn't say this is, I don't know how much of this would be Covenant Seminary as much as it would be that part of the co-curriculum of any seminary is where your students are going to church while they're studying.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so there was, I think that for the city kind of vibe was that the churches across the PCA that are sending their guys off to Covenant are probably more in that vein. And then also while you're attending seminary there, you're either going to land in kind of the more Kellerite influenced city church kind of contexts, or the kind of church that I went to. And so I think there's, that was part of that was part of it, but I never heard the Ordinary Means language until I was, until I was out of seminary. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't there. Just, people have different verbiage for different, for different things, for the same thing sometimes.
Yeah. I never had heard the phrase Ordinary Means of Grace during my time of Covenant. And it took me a while to discover that as I studied the Shorter Catechism. But I think what all of this boils down to is Covenant has really adopted a missional approach to missions, church missions, and you can find that in Chris Wright and Michael Goheen. Mm-hmm. The sort of the ethos of the seminary is training pastors who are going into the world, joining God in His mission to restore the world pre-fall. Our mission now is, as a church, is to restore creation back to where it was, back to the garden. And that sounds great, but is that our mission? Did Christ command His disciples, His apostles, to do that? Or is that God's mission? Mm-hmm. And Philip, you were hinting at this, but it sounds great on paper, but once you understand the impact of how great that, if your mission is to become God to the world and to transform the world, I mean, you've got not only to be a pastor, you've got to be a professor, you've got to be an academic, you've got to be influential, you got to be able to speak to the farmer and the businessman at the same time, and you'll feel very quickly woefully unqualified to do all of those things. So the Ordinary Means of Grace is freeing. It is so liberating. Here is what Christ has commanded His church to do.
And I would say that, so because I still think, in terms of the 3 wings and the labels that I think Brad Chapel came up with, confessional or doctrinal, missional, and or transformational. I still think I'm a transformational. I'm just very different than most of the other transformational guys in the PCA, because I think it comes through the Ordinary Means of Grace. When you look at the most radically transformed people in church history, I mean, just go to Acts 2. The Holy Spirit fell to the point where they could see tongues of fire above people's heads. And what were those people who had witnessed the church go from little under 200 to thousands overnight? Mm-hmm. What were they dedicating themselves to? The Ordinary Means of Grace. It's right there in Scripture.
Well, and they even said these men are turning the world upside down.
Yes. These 12 ordinary men turn the world upside down. And when you think about one of the passages of Scripture that the typical PCA transformationalist loves to cite is Jeremiah 29, and they'll go to the verse that says, "Seek the peace or the shalom, seek the welfare of the city." But they miss the command before that, where He says, "Don't decrease, increase, get married, build homes, build your gardens, enjoy the fruit of your labors, have babies, give your daughters away in marriage, find wives for your sons. And in my opinion,
It all sounds very ordinary.
that all sounds very ordinary. Exactly. And there's a difference between, I think, the church organic and the church as an institution. And one of the things that I think that the typical transformationalist gets wrong is that they, as the pastor, as the leader of the local church institution, is trying to do all of these things and lead all the people in the organic, everyday stuff that they're supposed to be equipping the saints to do. And so I think my job is, because we at my church, we believe that the church organic is gonna help transform the culture around us, but it has to start in our home. You know, if our own kids are undiscipled, you know, oh, congratulations, you reached all these non-Christians in your neighborhood, but now the covenant children that you raised in your home are non-believers, or they're poorly discipled believers who are easily influenced by the world. That seems like putting the cart before the horse. And so there's these very ordinary things that we are to be about. And as we do the ordinary things as church institution, as church organic, extraordinary things happen slowly. That's the analogy of the kingdom and the gospels, is that the kingdom grows slowly over time. It's not this, you know, it's not this big, like, overnight thing. So I think that's how I came about to the perspective that I have now, is I just kind of kept reading the scriptures and found that, you know, God's word still rings true. It's the same. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And it's through doing these very ordinary things that extraordinary things happen, by the grace of God, through his spirit, preaching of his word. So that to me is part of my trajectory that I think, was a big change in me, is how these things, how God does these things, is through very ordinary means.
Yeah, Philip, in your article, you say the broadly reformed seem to make secondary things the main thing, whether it is in the Arts Center, emphasis on renewing the city, or other societal issues. And I think, you know, what Nate has picked up on, you know, if you read the book of Acts and you see in Ephesus, where Paul's been preaching there for a couple of years, the society's been transformed so much so that the silversmiths and the idol makers are running out of work because people aren't buying their little trinkets anymore. And what was it that transformed the city? It was the word, sacraments, and prayer. It wasn't.
Yeah. He didn't set up like an art exhibit, you know, highlighting how Zeus is, you know, God is like Zeus or something like that. He preached the word of God over and over again for a period of years, and then you see the transformation.
Yeah. So it sounds like for each of you, it was doing ministry and then being in the Word that led you to discover the riches of this ordinary old school Presbyterianism that's just founded on those plain ordinary means of grace. The preaching of the Word is how God does his work. The foolishness of preaching. If we can, I mean, obviously the apostle calls it that, but you know, it seems foolish to the wise, and yet God, in his foolishness, makes the wise.
What does Paul say in Romans 10? Faith comes by hearing, and hearing through the words of Christ. I mean, you can't get more simple than that.
I think it brought up, it also too was a relief. And as I've been in ministry longer, like I have not been asked questions about how can I renew my city? How can I start this or that? I've been asked questions like, my child who professed faith at 13 is now just graduated college before me. He's an atheist. Or I am seriously struggling with a lack of assurance. I cannot, you know, there's this sin that I keep just being conquered by. I don't know what to do. Or, you know, our marriage is struggling, this, that, the other. Like it's always about things that the Word of God only can solve, not, you know, these extra, you know, curriculars of or outworkings of our Christian faith. It's the inward spiritual life that needs addressing, and you know, the relationships within the church or within the local family of believers. So that's that was another thing that just the things I thought I was going to be, interacting with were not even what was coming up to me on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And a good example of that, Phil, is just because I was there within the past 10 years, but my first semester at Covenant, there was a conference on gentrification. And as a just a poor boy from the South, I had no idea what the heck is gentrification. And it really put a bad taste in my mouth. Like, why are we even talking about this in a Reformed seminary? But that's just an example of putting what happens when the secondary things, like, we want to see a just society.
That's right.
Where the poor and the wealthy live together and worship Christ together. We want to see those things. But that comes through the gospel. That comes through the ordinary means of grace, not through political or social activism.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that struck me is because I purposefully, whenever the text demands of it, for example, I preached Isaiah 58 this past Sunday, and there's some things in there about, quote, social justice that are in the text, and I'm required to explain it. But I think one of the things that gets messed up here, and this is where I won't think it's a covenant thing. I think it's I've noticed it in kind of the more broadly reformed, missional, transformational crowd, is that because there's a confusion of law and gospel, there's kind of an antinomian ethos. There's kind of like we don't really understand the third use of the law or think there really is one. And so, well, then if we don't have a third use of the law, well, what do we do with all of these commands? Well, then all of a sudden we accidentally fold them back into gospel. We make them gospel issues when they're not gospel issues. This is, now that the gospel's changed us, to quote Schaeffer's book title, how should we then live? Like, what do we do? And, so for example, gentrification, sometimes gentrification happens because the government continues to raise property taxes over and over and over again. And you have these people that have lived in the neighborhood for 40 or 50 years. And they can no longer afford to live in the home that they raised their kids and grandkids in. And to me, that's a form of devouring widows' houses that, and you can read the Proverbs, and you can read, aspects of the wisdom literature in the Bible, and read the words of Jesus. There's all kinds of problems with treating people this way. These are not gospel issues, though. Like if someone fails to agree with you on how we go about fixing this problem in our society, they are not denying the gospel.
Right.
And that's what getting this wrong does, is it creates this us versus them mentality, where if you're not with me 100% on this issue, you're attacking the very foundations and heart of the gospel. No. We both believe the gospel. Now we're having a debate about Christian ethics and how we apply the law of God out in the world. And so I think that's where there needs to be some reformation in the thinking of some brothers, is because they're confusing the law and the gospel, and therefore the people that they're discipling are being confused as well. And then these guys go off to various seminaries, and then they become pastors, and the problem perpetuates. So anyway, that's where.
Well, if everything is a gospel issue, then there is no gospel.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Because
it's all the same news.
If everything is important, nothing's important.
Right.
And we heard, one, I guess he's not PCA anymore, but one prominent, formerly PCA megachurch pastor, saying that, love your neighbor is the gospel. And, that is precisely not the gospel. There's no good news there. If that's the gospel, that's not good news for me.
Yeah. That's the fruit of someone believing the gospel, but it's not the root of the gospel. Anyway, it's just you're just, again, conflating sanctification and justification. It's like it's like we learn nothing from the Reformation. We're still it's like we're still making these old mistakes again and again.
Yeah. So, Philip, in your article from Reformation 21, which we'll of course link in the show notes if my production team can get its act together, you talk about other factors that finding the ordinary, old school, the means of grace ministry to be so liberating. Then you talk about the national partnership. How did that unveiling impact you? I mean, you had some hilarious comments there that you had that friend who thought he was part of it, but then saw the emails and realized he wasn't at the cool kid table.
Yeah, this was hilarious. This was so. So I also share a quote from Tom Cannon.
Yeah. Let me
And
just
so
pull up that article.
I remember being in Edwards Hall, which is like our kind of cafeteria relaxation wing of the seminary. And I was sitting at a table of friends, and they're like, "Have you heard about this new organization, the National Partnership?" And they referenced the friend that I was talking about referenced Tom Cannon's article. So I looked it up when I got back to my apartment, and Tom was. I don't think he's in the PCA anymore, but he was definitely National Partnership material, and he was invited to join it. And he kind of wrote a scathing review of its purposes. Now, this would have been, I think, 2012 or 13. And that was like the last I heard of it. I remember, I knew Tom, and I was just like, man, if he's not, wanting to be part of it or whatever, like this will probably just, this probably won't like fizzle out or, whatever. So I go on to Atlanta to do another graduate degree. I serve in a PCA church for a little while, but I was trying to get ordained and licensed in the PCA, and through a series of events that didn't work out. So I leave the PCA. When I come back, like all my friends were supposedly part of the National Partnership. And I started seeing people like sharing things like Todd Pruitt's pieces, the National Partnership is up to shenanigans. And I thought Todd was just being cranky. Maybe he didn't get an invite. I don't know. And so I just didn't think it was that big of a deal, because it's all the guys that like I knew and went to school with, and even, big names that were also connected to Covenant. National Partnership is not just a Covenant thing. Plenty of people's names on that list go to all the other institutions, just to be clear.
I actually did a breakdown. I studied the group of guys in that email, and there's plenty of RTS grads. Sorry, Ryan. Plenty of Westminster guys, plenty of RTS guys. It is not a Covenant only crowd for sure.
Any Greenville or Knox Seminary guys? I'm just curious.
I actually don't think so.
I don't think so. Those were kind of.
I don't think that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I'm like, I want to get an invite. I'm about to be headed towards ordination. I want to be in the National Partnership. This is like my kind of tribe, I guess, or whatever. And so a friend was like, "Oh, it's super easy. I'll send you the guy to contact to get on this email list." So I get on this email list, and I start getting emails, and they're completely harmless. It's like a devotional, actually some great things about networking. Like, hey, this pastor's looking for an assistant. I'm like, this is what everyone's bent out of shape about. Mm-hmm. You guys are ridiculous. And then the infamous leak happens, and I reached out to the friend that had invited me to this group. And I was telling him about the leak or whatever. And he said, "Well, I don't think it's the same thing, because I haven't ever gotten any of these emails."
Oh, no.
Dude, I don't think you were in the National Partnership then. And he was just in this other email list, which was not necessarily connected to them at all.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I was just kind of like, oh, all right. So this really was pretty secretive. And then reading about it, and then just kind of I referenced gaslighting in there too. Again, I'm not saying anybody intentionally sought out to gaslight, but it's kind of it to me feels a lot like what we're seeing today with the news breaking of Joe Biden pardoning, Hunter or whatever. For like months now, he's been asked, "Are you going to pardon, Joe, your Hunter? Are you going to pardon him?" He's like, no. All of a sudden he does it. For how long was the National Partnership having a spotlight put on them? They're like, "We're not secretive. We're not trying to do anything about committees in the General Assembly. We're not trying to do this. We're not trying to." And then, well, lo and behold, they were trying to do all that.
Yeah. Well, and that's right, because there was guys that were asked. I witnessed this happen in open forums online. They were asked direct questions about the purpose and nature and existence of the National Partnership, and they're like, "No, this is all it is." And it turns out they weren't part of it. They were confused. They were giving incorrect information, some of them, because they generally thought like, "No, I'm on those emails. Like nothing you're saying is happening. Like we're like, here's all it is." And it created a lot of confusion, and it made some guys look like they were being dishonest with their brothers when they weren't. They weren't part of whatever else was out there. They were just part of this one email chain and not the others. And so it caused a lot of confusion and a lot of division and so anyway.
Yeah, I remember when I was
sorry,
a student. Well, when I was a student, I sent an email out to somebody that I thought who was in the national partnership, and they sent me enter your email here mailing list, and I joined the mailing list, but I never received anything from it ever. So I don't
Maybe
know
it went
what
to your
list I
spam
was on.
folder.
I was on the blacklist, I think. But
Phil, when you say you felt gaslight, you're not accusing anyone. That's just how you felt, right? We're this is a bunch of Covenant grads. You can talk about your feelings here, and that's what that's.
Yes.
I assume something y'all are very comfortable doing it from Covenant
Very in
Seminary
touch with
there.
my emotions.
That's right.
get out of here.
So this was kind of a turning point for you. Then you said, "Well, I thought it was this, but it's actually this."
Yeah. Yeah, and that was I think just it was disappointing. There was some big names associated in that, and then also just the continued fruit of that. Like we've already mentioned that one mega church pastor who was part of the national partnership who's no longer in the PCA. That there have been others that as well that that I'm not saying they're not believers, but they were so broadly reformed that I think it was becoming harder for them to fit within the PCA's confessional life, and even and so they've moved on from here, which I think is a good thing for numerous reasons. But that is more of it was just a kind of a disappointment, a little bit of a letdown of some of that. And that's why it leads into that integrity thing where I got maybe
talk to me about that. You mentioned winsome bullies, or you say bullies who are telling you to be winsome. What does that entail?
So some of the bigger disciplinary cases that have made not just PCA news, but even like Christianity Today articles have been about some of the guys that were the broadly reformed, writing books like Gentleness is the Answer or whatever it is, and things like that are in one sense saying to the way to keep doing this Christian thing is to be kind and gentle and winsome, but they're terrorizing their staff. And to me that was like a huge thing of just integrity. I mean that's pretty much hypocrisy. And then not just maybe in that example, but the PCA church in San Francisco, a city church. And if you guys don't know the story of City Church, you should 100% look at it. It was a Keller disciple, blanking on the dude's name now, but he goes out to San Francisco with PCA money to plant a PCA church. And then they wanted women elders. So they left the PCA for the Reformed Church in America. And today, when you pull up their website, it's a rainbow flag with, women's elders, senior pastor, LGBTQ plus IA to affirming all that stuff. And that's also happened as well in Nashville. So there's a bit of this, to me, a lack of it. Like we don't see, and I think Zach Groff has done a lot of good by tracking this. When we see departures from the PCA, we really don't see a lot of guys departing to the OPC or the RPCNA or the Free Church microcosm denomination. We see them all going EPC or even now more uptick of PCUSA or ECO or whatever the other one is.
How many? And that's a great point. How many times over the years have guys taken PCA money, planted a church, and then as soon as they're particularized and on their feet financially, they bounce out to the free church or to RPCNA or whatever, versus how many times does it go the other direction? It's a lot more in the direction you've described, to the EPC, ECO, et cetera. And I would say that part of my, journey in getting, quote, radicalized to, I vote with confessionals on pretty much every single issue at every court. Part of my journey is that if you've seen the meme, there's like a blue guy and a red guy and they're arguing, and the purple guy is there, and the purple guy gets shoved by the blue guy over to the guy, and the guy on the red side kind of catches him so he doesn't fall flat on his face and kind of gets him back on his feet. And then the blue guy starts yelling at the purple guy, "Why are you over there with those guys?" And I can't tell you how many stories there are that I've personally heard over the last decade of Covenant grads that were told growing up in the PCA or entering the PCA, not by professors at Covenant per se, but by fellow students and pastors, et cetera, that those TR guys, those RTS Jackson guys, those Greenville guys, it's their way or the highway. You're just not truly reformed. We're the winsome ones. We're the warm and welcoming. And man, honestly, my experience has been it's been the furthest thing from the truth. When I was struggling in licensure and ordination exams, sure, there were some Covenant grads that had lunch with me or bought me a cup of coffee and helped me sort some things out. But it was a Greenville professor of all things that took me under his wing and helped mentor me and counsel me. When I showed up at a Greenville conference 3 years ago as a Covenant guy, I'm pretty much the only Covenant guy in the room. There wasn't a single one of them that went, "Hey, what are you doing here? Like, what do you do?" They're all like, "You're a Covenant grad and you came to our spring conference. We're so glad you're here. Sit down and have a beer with us." Right. But when a Greenville guy is in a PCA church planters forum online and starts asking questions about church planting, what does he get from the quote winsome guys? I'll tell you what he gets. He gets questions rooted in suspicion. Why do you want to know about church planting? And you may say that those are just two anecdotal stories, but there are a dozen brothers in the PCA right now that can cite the exact same thing. Again and again, the guys with the winsome branding, it's projection for not all of them, but for many of them, it's projection. They know that they're a tyrant to their staff. So they need to write more about grace and about just basking in the sonship of Jesus and blogging about it and, preaching it on Twitter. And it's not real. And guys see it. I mean, you can't tell you how many guys I've met that were the purple guy and they kept getting shoved over and they kept witnessing this. They kept seeing, well, wait a minute, you're the winsome guy. Why are you so hostile towards this person that disagrees with you? Why is his disagreement with you not just a theological difference? Why are you making it about his feelings and emotions towards you? Anyway, I could go on and on about that. And there's stories out there for other people to tell because it's not my business to relay their stories publicly, but this is a serious issue. And one of my solutions to this problem, and I've publicly said this, I've written about it, I'll say it again, is that we need to police our own tribes. When a transformational, progressive, missional, whatever you want to call them, when they see people in their own tribe treating others this way, they need to call it out and they need to bring that guy aside and say, no, that's not what we do here. We're winsome and reformed. We're winsomely reformed. That's not how we operate. And when there's guys, I've done this on Twitter, when there's guys from the confessional side that are being uncharitable, I contact them. I openly disagree with them. That's what needs to happen to make a healthier PCA is that guys need to, our friendships don't need to be completely and entirely grounded in how we vote. And when we see guys in our own tribe, acting out of line, we need to be willing to pull them aside and say, "Hey, here's some thoughts for you. Maybe this isn't the best path for dealing with these issues." So I could go on and on about that. I'll let Charles or Philip jump in, but I thought Philip did a great job of addressing that issue. On kind of the winsome. Seeing how the captains of the winsome team have been bullies has been, I think, very unfortunate for the transformational camp or tribe in the PCA. It's been very unfortunate for those churches that have suffered because of that. But I don't see people from that camp and tribe rebuking that, calling that out, and dealing with it. In fact, what we've seen is people from that tribe allowing those men to leave the PCA with their credentials intact, or allowing those men to just kind of quietly demit and move on. And it's just, that's not the way I think we should handle this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Charles, anything you wanted to add?
No, that was great. I agree.
Okay. um, so then, Philip, you talk about how you left the PCA, and not out of protest or anything, but you served in the Episcopal Church, and you realize, I don't know what it means to be a Presbyterian. So tell me how that went. If you
Yeah.
can, I know you wrote about it in your article, and I hope you will read it. It's a jolly article, I thought. I was laughing out loud. I think I just read it out loud to my wife and said, "This is so funny."
I'm glad it was humorous. I'm glad I like the description, jolly.
Jolly
Yeah,
article.
so I went to the Episcopal Church. That is a crazy story. Don't recommend it. But I was attached to a group of the remaining conservatives within the Episcopal Church. I still have a couple of friends that have continued to make that a ministry and pray for those brothers. But it was at a conference of EFAC, which was originally started by John Stott, actually. And again, these conservatives kind of restarted it in the United States. The American branch had fallen away. And I was at a conference, and I was talking to a retired minister who serves at a huge Episcopal church in Nashville that's conservative. And but he had been a Church of England minister for like 25, 30 years or something like that before he came to the U.S. And I was asking him about, like, just explain to me the waywardness of the Episcopal and Anglican communion. Because these guys were not in denial. They were like, we've drifted significantly. And he tied it to a lack of historic identity. The church continued to veer away from historical identity markers, which used to be low church worship, not high church. So the Anglo-Catholic thing was a big disruptor.
Yeah, that's the Oxford movement.
Yeah, it's the Oxford movement.
19th century.
That was not the norm. It was
Right.
not. It was complete innovation. So low church worship and subscription to the 39 articles. And also, I didn't put this in here, but also I don't know exactly how he would phrase it, but an agreement with the Book of Homilies, which were written by Cranmer and were a series of sermons. They're great. They're really good Reformed sermons. And the homilies and the 39 articles have just vanished from the identity of the Anglican communion at large within the liberal wing of it. But that became the drifting. The more they said, we don't need to subscribe to these aren't authoritative, as they removed those benchmarks, you saw the drift take place and a lack of connection to the historical identity. So when I came back into the PCA, I was like, what does it mean to be Presbyterian? Not what does it mean to be an American evangelical?
Right.
What does it mean to be Young Restless Reformed? What does it mean to be a historically Presbyterian and Reformed Christian and minister? And so I grabbed Dr. Clark's Reformed. Oh my gosh, why am I blanking on the name? Recovering the Reformed Confessions. And I remember I put this in there. Westminster Cali guys and Covenant faculty kind of disagreed over republication, and maybe you did. We're not getting into a conversation about that. But even, kind of viewed as more the TR guys. And I read Clark and I was like, man, this is exactly kind of what I was looking for. Like, I didn't realize the rich heritage of more classically traditional Reformed worship or the subscription and authority of the confessions and catechisms and how they actually play a role in ministry and my own piety. They're not just intellectual documents. They're heart-stirring, spiritual, nourishing documents. They can, spurn on piety, not diminish it. And so that was kind of the beginning of my, moving towards confessionalism, was actually being away from the PCA and realizing as I'm coming back into it, if we keep broadening, if we keep expanding our tent, we are going to become unmoored from the Presbyterian part. We may stay evangelical, but we're going to become the Presbyterian thing will just disappear.
Yeah.
It kind of becomes like, whose line is it anyway? The theology's made up and the doctrinal points don't matter, and I think, I've seen that in other churches. I sojourned after seminary. When I met my wife, we kind of sojourned out of the PCA for a couple of years and then came back into the PCA when we moved to Chattanooga and started attending a church in our presbytery there. And yeah, I think that brief season outside of the PCA made me more thankful for doctrinal standards and just clear. I mean, I tell people all the time, hey, you can find everything I believe about 33 major doctrinal topics on the internet, and more, because there's the shorter and larger catechisms. Can you really say the same about yourself? Right? Can you really say that I could go and easily discern what you believe about God and the scriptures, theology, etc., without you having to just start at square one and sort it all out? So I'm really thankful. I'm thankful to be a part of the PCA. I'm thankful to be a part of a denomination that has very clearly stated, and they're not new either. 400-year-old set of doctrinal standards that we can, there's clarity, there's an honesty to it, and I really appreciate it. And I'm thankful to be in the PCA. And I know from this article that Philip definitely is. So
yeah. Well, what about? Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Charles.
Well, I just want to interrupt here. I don't know if we can trust Phil, former Pentecostal, former Episcopalian. Does he know what? Does he know what this podcast is? How did you get an invite?
Yeah, I didn't know all that until when I invited him. So
Yeah.
Well, the key word is former. He's not a crypto Pentecostal or a crypto Episcopalian.
So my oldest, when we left the Episcopal Church, the next Sunday we were back at a PCA church, and rightly she was about 5 at that time, so she's cognitive enough to be like, I got questions. And so we're driving back home from church, and she goes, okay, so explain this to me. We were in the Episcopal Church, but now you're telling me we're going to be in a Presbyterian church again? And my wife, married up, man, I tell you, my wife, without missing a beat, goes, honey, we never stopped being Presbyterian. That was the problem.
Yep.
That was part of the reason it didn't work in the Episcopal Church. Todd didn't agree with bishops, didn't agree with a lot of stuff. It was thankful to be pulled out.
Yeah.
Well, that was another, if I can just interject on that, I think even in the PCA and our 3 tribes, there's kind of a disagreement over church government, even though we wouldn't maybe admit it. But during my time in seminary, I became even more appreciative of the ruling elder. It dawned upon me just how thankful I was for my ruling elders back home. And then 2 ruling elders in the church that I attended during seminary were just so impactful and positively influential in my own life. Certainly benefited from the preaching and teaching of the word at that church, but it was ruling elders that really, through pastoral care and counsel and friendship, shepherded me and discipled me. And it really grieves me to see young guys in the PCA openly diminishing the office of the ruling elder. We've talked about it on this show before, I believe, or Ryan has with other guests perhaps, but just that there's almost like a soft Episcopalianism or clericalism that is being that is in the minds of some that wants the ruling elder to just kind of be the backbone of the local church, but not really have a role at Presbytery or General Assembly. And so I think if we're not careful, we could slip into kind of a Presbyterianism. And I think already, oh man, I'm gonna get in trouble. I think already there's kind of, I call it evangelicalizational. There's kind of already an evangelicalizational format at times to General Assembly and to other aspects of the PCA that seems to be contrary to kind of the grassroots Presbyterianism that I've come to have such an affection for. And I'd like to see reform in that area, but that's maybe a different conversation for a different day. But if we're not careful, we'll end up kind of veering into a soft Episcopalian format, which Philip can tell you firsthand that it's not good.
I can agree with that too, Nate. During my time at Covenant, it was a couple ruling elders at Kirk of the Hills in St. Louis who helped mentor me, and we had breakfast every Tuesday. And I fell in love with them and just rediscovered the wonders of that office because, I was Southern Baptist. I didn't know the difference or anything about teaching and ruling elders at the time. I do wonder how, if this is maybe chasing a rabbit here, but I do wonder if the professionalization of ministry tied to that transformational emphasis of missions I wonder if that contributes to this idea that the teaching elder is more important because he has to do all things and be all things. While the ruling elders, they do, they've got their own jobs,
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, that's neither here nor there.
Well, I think you're onto something. I needed to bring something up so I could just make sure I'm correct on this. But when I was getting through, when I was getting through licensure and ordination, someone recommended a book to me. It was a book by Tim Keller called Center Church, I think, or City Church, one of the two. It's some Keller book on like church mission. And anyway, so as he recommended it to me, he explained to me that, hey, you're the teaching elder. So you are the one that casts the vision for the church, and the ruling elders kind of get on board and help drive the boat towards your mission and vision. And even as he was saying it, I mean, I wasn't even ordained at the time, and I was like, I don't think that's right. I didn't say it out loud, but I thought it. And the further along I get, the more I realize, no, it's really good and important and healthy for the ruling elders of the local church to not be yes men. I mean, I've seen it happen even just recently. A friend of mine was being an interim at a church, and he was like, man, these ruling elders, they have not been allowed to shepherd. They've just been yes men. They don't know, like, they got to figure out how to shepherd. Like, before we bring on another pastor, they've got to figure out that they're the ones cultivating the mission and vision, because they've just been kind of getting dragged around, from teaching elder to teaching elder. And it causes tons of devastation when the teaching elder leaves. And that's been the culture at the church. So it is healthy, in my opinion, when the ruling elders are the backbone of the local church, the backbone of the PCA, when they're helping cast the mission and vision of the church and driving it. Because let's be honest, a teaching elder can get fired tomorrow or up and leave for a different call tomorrow. But how many times has a ruling elder come to a session meeting and saying, guys, I'm heading off to another church to go be a ruling elder there? I mean, how many, honestly, maybe less than a dozen times ever, unless it's like a church planning situation. So it's really important for the locally grown and raised up shepherds to be a huge part of casting the mission and vision.
And sometimes as a teaching elder, I may have a vision, but it sucks. Like, it's terrible.
Yeah. Fair enough.
And I need, we need ruling elders to sort of reel us in. And you're exactly right.
If your vision there, Nate, is to go redeem the arts in Louisville, your ruling elders may say, that ain't going to work here, boy.
Louisville?
Louisville,
Tennessee. Yeah, honestly, if redeeming the arts here would be pretty difficult, because I don't think there's much arts here in this particular town. I mean, go to Maryville or Knoxville, yes, but there'd have to be something to redeem in the first place. Anyway.
Yeah. So you redeem sinners, or Christ redeems sinners. Let's. You mentioned one more thing here, Philip, about the company of pastors. Is that kind of a secret group that you're a part of? That what is? Tell me about these company of pastors.
Yeah. So this is probably the best thing that's happened to me in ministry. And again, when I was just got ordained, and I was in a town with two PCA churches, but one was a solo pastor. One had a pretty established staff, several teaching elders. So I just wasn't entirely on their radar of somebody that like may need some help or want some, connectionalism within, just fellow pastors. And I know a friend of the show, Derek Bright, messaged me, and he said, "Hey man, you probably need some friends. You probably need some help. So why don't you join this company of pastors?" And it's through the Gospel Reformation Network. So yes, it's got an affinity group, I guess you could say, within the PCA. But it's mainly a chance for us to gather. It's, a group of guys. And we share what's going on in ministry together. We encourage one another. Like in my group, we had a guy without a call for almost like a year and a half. And just being there to encourage him to hear. And it wasn't like he wasn't getting interviews and stuff. Like it was just heartbreak and all this stuff. But, that's really, it's not, we're not doing political machinations or machinations, whatever the phrase is, for, General Assembly. We're just sharing about what it's like to pastor and shepherd, and it's become great. I think I text that group probably every day, sometimes multiple times a day. We get together, like I said, at various events, whether it's GA or Twin Lakes, and so it's been really encouraging. And it's not the only one. Like, that's more of, I guess, a formal one. And you can just, if you are a pastor, a teaching elder that is looking for something like that, you can easily just join. You can go to the Gospel Reformation Network. It's got a Company of Pastors thing there about how to get involved, and there's not a test of or any kind. It's just, I'd love to be part of this. And so it's been super beneficial. It's not the only one I'm a part of. I got another group that's actually related, I guess, out of this article. It was me and two other Covenant grads, Bo Collins and Kyle Dillon, who we all kind of started seeing each other's social media stuff over the past few years and realized we kind of have also moved more towards the confessional wing of the PCA. And so we started just texting each other more as well. And so, I mean, that's almost like a company of pastors, but it's just a time for us to get together. So I shared that too, because I'm not against affinity groups, like the Alliance for Mission and Renewal. Is that their name? Like, I think those things can be helpful for coming alongside brothers that have similar convictions or fall on the same spectrum within the PCA. And both that group and the Gospel Reformation Network are doing it, out in the open, above board. There's not secret meetings or handshakes or emails. So that's kind of what it is.
Yeah. I'm the other Covenant grad in that GRN group that he's referencing.
Yeah. Full disclosure.
Full
Nate and I are
disclosure.
in the same one.
That's why, I mean, in part, that's why I'm here. That's why I agreed to be on today, because I think when it's nice when guys text you or call you and say, hey, I read that article, or I saw you on that podcast and I appreciate what you said, but it's a whole nother thing. I think it's important for guys to kind of publicly go shoulder to shoulder with someone else who's giving some thoughts and feedback and say, yep, I can co-sign on these things. And I'm with him on this. And so I thought this was a great article, and I could heartily amen all of the things, and particularly the last line, which is, let us learn not to judge a man by where he graduated, but by his continued convictions to the gospel of Jesus Christ and his endurance and plodding along in gospel ministry. We have to have a growth mindset, not a fixed mindset. Guys change and they grow, and it goes the other way too. Just because someone is confessional and orthodox and faithful today doesn't mean that 20 years from now they will be. That's one of the helpful things about things like the GRN cohort that we're in, is praying for each other, holding each other accountable, encouraging one another, setting goals, holding each other accountable to meet those goals. And so get a company of pastors, even if it's not with GRN. You need guys, whether it's in your presbytery or otherwise, that you're in constant contact with, getting encouragement from, praying for and with, and it'll bless your ministry for sure.
Yes.
Agreed.
Yes. Well, as we bring it in for a close, what encourages y'all about the PCA right now? Other than the rightward, more confessional trajectory of Covenant grads.
I think what's... Oh,
go
ahead,
ahead,
Charles. I've talked a lot, man. You go.
Oh, well, I was just going to say I've been greatly encouraged by our generation of men entering into the PCA, being ordained. There seems to be a revival of interest into the confessions of faith and our BCO and Presbyterian history and polity. That's coming from both Covenant and RTS and Westminster as well. I'm seeing it all over. In fact, backtrack a little bit, Phil, I shared your article with several friends of mine who graduated from Covenant, and they all said the same thing. Like, this is spot on. Like, you were able to put into words what so many of us have been feeling for so many years. So thank you for that. But I've been encouraged by the revival of interest into Presbyterianism, our polity, our confessions. It really seems like our denomination is moving in a good direction. And it's kind of hard to put to words, but I think we're becoming more and more proud of being Presbyterian, proud of our heritage, proud of our confessions of faith and all that. And whereas, I feel like, I came in 2017. I feel like for a decade there, maybe 2 decades there, we so wanted to be like everyone else. We wanted to be broadly evangelical. We wanted to speak to the world. Not saying that those things are unimportant, but when you're trying to reach a broad audience, a broad evangelical audience, you sort of lose your distinctives. And I think we're coming back to those.
Well said.
Yeah,
I'll say something controversial, but not chargeable. I think a sign of our health is actually the fact that I'm looking forward to the past 2 General Assemblies have been relatively not full of controversy and long floor debates into the wee hours of the morning. Like I had a friend share that he disagrees with the overture that was sent from Calvary for this upcoming GA about the constitutionalization of the Directory for Public Worship. And he said, I mean, we've got bigger things to be doing. I said, well, I actually think this is encouraging. We're not debating sexuality. We're not still going on over and over again about revoice or the new perspective or whatever else, controversial things. We're actually starting to hone in on some other things that maybe need to be addressed, like
pastoral, practice that's not, the basic, just fundamental things like sanctification.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So, I actually think it's a mark of health.
Yeah.
And I know this could be a long GA floor debates into the wee hours because people have very strong opinions about this. But I actually think that's a sign of the marked health. Going even to your comment, Charles, that we're becoming more proud. And so maybe we're revisiting things our fathers didn't get to finish, which is kind of thanks to Jared Nelson's work. I think that's what happened with the Directory of Public Worship. And there's my cards on the table of my feelings about it.
Well, we have the bandwidth now because everything's not being, all the oxygen's not being absorbed by a single church in St. Louis, and they're bad acting. And that's really encouraging.
Yeah. I would say we've talked about this before, but just the massive amount of Presbyterian confessional media, blogs, podcasts, video, all of the stuff that's coming down the pipe. And I think that's incredibly encouraging. I think it's been encouraging to see ruling elders show up at General Assembly. But I would give a caution. Conservatives in civil politics and conservatives in ecclesial work, there's parallels. And conservatives typically, once they get some momentum and some wins, they're too quick to coast and to enjoy the victory and to pretend like, hey, we're done. Like we did good job. We held off this issue. We pushed back against this issue and kept it out of the church. And I think that's a bad mindset. And I think we saw the consequences of that at General Assembly this last year as we started talking about oaths and vows and allowing, non-Christians or avowed atheists rather to testify in church courts. And so my word of encouragement and caution to the conservatives out there, all 13 of you that'll hear this podcast,
and my mother
and Ryan's mom and mine, she'll watch because I'm on it, and that's what moms do. My word of caution would be, don't do that. You need to show up this summer. We all got stuff going on. We all got vacations and this and that. You really need to be at General Assembly because we're going to continue to have this issue pressed. And then I would also encourage, because I've seen I saw one particular overture. Maybe we can have this conversation another time. That concerns me because another thing that conservatives are really good at is once we get momentum, we find ways to shoot ourselves in the foot. And I think there will be some overtures coming the next couple of years that will serve to divide the more confessional guys in the room, which will give breathing room to people that want to bring things into the General Assembly that are not good for our denomination. So I think there needs to be some strategic, critical thought about what we do in the next 4 or 5 years, so that we can keep the momentum going and keep our church faithful to the scriptures. And that's all I have to say about that, in the words of Forrest Gump.
Yeah. Well, and that's an interesting, an important point you make, that, some things don't need to be in the Constitution. Some things don't need to be said. Our forefathers, when they were amending the American version of the Constitution, they took out the reference to the Pope as the Antichrist, not necessarily because they didn't believe it, but they said, we don't need to argue about that if it's not in our constitutional standard. So we can keep our focus on what we need as a denomination.
Yeah.
I think we need to go against post mills in our denomination. Really need to start a war with them.
Well, on that note, thank the two of you for joining, and Charles, we've noted your presence as well. No, in all seriousness, guys, thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience at Covenant. I hope people are encouraged that good things are coming out of Covenant Seminary. It's not a perfect school, but it is our PCA school, and so we need to support Covenant Seminary and encourage confessional appreciation and love for our Reformed heritage there. So thanks for sharing your own thoughts, especially Philip, in that article.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Thanks for having me again, Ryan, and seeing you guys.
Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard Podcast. You just heard from pastors Philip Ryan, Nate Xanders, and Charles Stover, all graduates of Covenant Seminary, reflecting on their experience there and how they have grown in love for the Confession of Faith, the Westminster Standards, during their time as pastors here in the Presbyterian Church in America. I hope that you have been encouraged by this second season of the Westminster Standard Podcast. If you have, please consider making a donation on our website, jude3pca.org, and also on our website. If you can't make a donation, there's still lots of resources and articles there aimed at highlighting the riches of our Reformed faith. Please join me again next week for an interview with Matthew Everhard on his new book, Worshiptainment. I'll talk to you then.